My sister took credit for my cookbook on national TV, so I made one call that got her dropped before the second segment. I'm 31, and I've been passionate about cooking since I was 12 years old watching my grandmother make her famous Sunday dinners. What started as helping in the kitchen turned into culinary school, then working my way up in restaurant kitchens, and eventually developing my own unique style of fusion cooking that combines traditional Southern comfort food with Mediterranean flavors. It's been my dream for years to publish a cookbook, and last spring that dream finally became reality. My sister Natasha is 3 years younger than me and has always had this ability to talk her way into and out of anything. She's charming, confident, and has never met a spotlight she didn't want to stand in. Growing up, she was the one who got cast in school plays while I was content working backstage. She went into marketing after college and has always been good at selling ideas even when they weren't entirely her own. The cookbook project started 2 years ago when I decided to compile all the recipes I'd been developing and testing for nearly a decade. I called it Comfort Crossing because it bridged the gap between the Southern food I grew up with and the Mediterranean techniques I learned in culinary school. Every recipe in that book came from years of experimentation, late nights in my kitchen, adjusting measurements and testing flavors until they were perfect. I was working as a sous chef at a high-end restaurant while developing the cookbook, which meant most of my writing and testing happened during my off hours. I'd come home exhausted from a 12-hour shift and still spend 2 or 3 more hours perfecting a new recipe or writing the stories that accompanied each dish. My tiny apartment kitchen became my laboratory, and I documented everything with photos and detailed notes. Natasha was living in the same city at the time working for a boutique marketing firm, and she'd often come over for dinner when I was testing recipes. She'd always been a decent cook, nothing special, but she could follow directions and make basic meals. She seemed genuinely interested in what I was doing and would ask questions about techniques and flavor combinations. I was happy to share because I thought she was just being supportive. What I didn't realize was that Natasha was taking mental notes about everything. She'd ask me to explain my processes in detail, and sometimes she'd even take pictures of the dishes I made, claiming she wanted to remember them for later. I thought she was just being an enthusiastic sister who appreciated good food. Looking back now, I can see she was gathering information for her own purposes. The publishing process was long and frustrating. I sent my proposal to dozens of agents and publishers, getting rejection after rejection for months. Some said the market was too saturated, others said my concept wasn't unique enough. But I kept refining the proposal and finally found an agent who believed in the project. She helped me polish the manuscript, and eventually we found a small but respected publisher who specialized in specialty cookbooks. Natasha was one of the first people I told when I got the book deal. She screamed with excitement and said she was so proud of me that she always knew I'd make it as a chef. She offered to help with marketing and promotion since that was her area of expertise, and I was grateful for any help I could get. The publisher's marketing budget was limited, so having someone with professional experience willing to help for free seemed like a blessing. During the final months before publication, Natasha became increasingly involved in the project. She helped me set up social media accounts for the cookbook and coached me on how to talk about the book in interviews. She also helped me plan a launch party and reached out to her contacts in the media to try to get coverage for the book. I was touched by how invested she seemed in my success. The book was published in March, and the initial response was better than I'd hoped. Food bloggers were posting positive reviews, and I was getting interview requests from local media outlets. Natasha accompanied me to several of these interviews, saying she wanted to support me and learn about the process. She'd sit in the back of the studio or restaurant, and afterwards she'd give me feedback on my performance. One thing that started bothering me was how Natasha would sometimes jump into conversations about the cookbook when we were out together. If someone asked me about a particular recipe, she'd chime in with details before I could answer. When I mentioned it to her, she said she was just trying to help promote the book and that she'd absorbed so much information about it she felt like she could talk about it in her sleep. The breakthrough came when a producer from a national morning show reached out through my publisher saying they wanted to feature the cookbook in their cooking segment. It was exactly the kind of exposure every cookbook author dreams of, and I was over the moon. The segment was scheduled for Friday morning, and they wanted me to demonstrate 3 recipes from the book while talking about my inspiration and cooking philosophy. I spent weeks preparing for the appearance, practicing the recipes until I could make them blindfolded, and rehearsing talking points with Natasha's help. She was incredibly supportive during this time, helping me pick out an outfit, and even driving with me to the studio for moral support. The night before the taping, she took me out for dinner to celebrate and told me how proud she was of everything I'd accomplished. The morning of the taping, I was nervous but excited. This was my moment to share my passion with a national audience and hopefully sell enough books to justify my publisher's investment in me. Natasha came with me to the studio and sat in the green room while I got ready. She kept telling me I was going to be amazing and that this was just the beginning of big things for my career. But when I got to hair and makeup, the production assistant seemed confused about something. She kept checking her clipboard and asking me questions about my background and the cookbook. Finally, she said there might be some confusion about the booking and that she needed to check with the producer. My stomach dropped as I watched her walk away with a worried expression on her face. 20 minutes later, the production assistant came back with the producer, and they both looked uncomfortable. The producer explained that there had been a miscommunication about the booking and that they were expecting someone else. When I asked what she meant, she showed me the booking form, which listed Natasha's name as the cookbook author and featured guest for the segment. I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. According to their records, Natasha had written Comfort Crossing and was scheduled to appear on the show to promote her cookbook. When I tried to explain that there had been a mistake and that I was the actual author, they looked at me with polite skepticism. The producer said they'd need to sort this out quickly, since they were going live in less than an hour. That's when I saw Natasha standing in the doorway of the makeup room, looking like she'd been caught with her hand in the cookie jar. She was dressed professionally in an outfit I'd never seen before, and she was holding a copy of my cookbook. When our eyes met, she couldn't maintain eye contact, and I knew immediately what had happened. My own sister had somehow convinced the producers that she was the author of my cookbook. The next few minutes felt like an out-of-body experience as I tried to process what was happening. Natasha walked into the makeup room with this fake confident smile and said, "Hey sis, thanks for coming to support me today." The producer looked between us confused and asked how we knew each other. That's when Natasha said, "Oh, this is my sister. She helped me test some of the recipes for the book." I couldn't speak for a moment. The audacity of what she was saying, the casual way she was rewriting history right in front of me, left me completely speechless. The producer seemed to accept this explanation, though, and started briefing Natasha on the segment timing and what recipes they'd be preparing. I watched in horror as my sister nodded along like she knew exactly what she was talking about. Finally, I found my voice and said, "There's been a mistake. I'm the author of that cookbook, not her." The producer looked uncomfortable and glanced between Natasha and me like she was trying to figure out who was telling the truth. Natasha just laughed and said, "She's being modest. She did help a lot with the testing, and I always said I couldn't have done it without her." I pulled out my phone and showed the producer my contract with the publisher, my author bio, and photos of me cooking the recipes during development. But Natasha had come prepared too. She had business cards that listed her as a cookbook author and what looked like professional headshots. She even had a folder full of documents that I couldn't see clearly, but that seemed to support her claim. The producer was clearly stressed about the time crunch and said they needed to make a decision quickly. She suggested that maybe both of us could appear on the segment together as co-authors, but Natasha immediately shut that down, saying the booking was specifically for her and that adding another person would throw off the whole segment. I couldn't believe she was being so calculating about stealing my moment. That's when Natasha pulled me aside and whispered, "Just go with it, okay? We can sort this out later, but right now I need you to not make a scene." When I asked her what the hell she thought she was doing, she said, "Look, you're great at cooking, but you're terrible at promotion. I can sell this book better than you ever could, and we'll both benefit from the exposure." I was so shocked by her logic that I almost laughed. She genuinely seemed to believe that stealing my cookbook and appearing on national television as its author was somehow doing me a favor. When I told her she was insane and that I was going to tell the producer the truth, she grabbed my arm and said, "Think about what you're doing. If you make a scene now, it'll ruin everything for both of us." The production assistant came back and said they needed the cookbook author in makeup immediately. Natasha squeezed my arm one more time and said, "Trust me on this," before following the assistant out of the room. I stood there alone, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to march into that studio and expose her right there on live television, but I was afraid of creating a disaster that would hurt the book's chances. I ended up in the green room watching my sister get professionally styled while claiming credit for years of my work. She looked completely comfortable and confident, like she'd been preparing for this moment her whole life. When someone from the crew asked her about her culinary background, she smoothly talked about growing up in a family that loved to cook and how she'd always been passionate about food. The segment was supposed to start at 8:30, and as that time approached, I felt sick to my stomach. I watched the monitor as the host introduced Natasha as the author of Comfort Crossing and praised her innovative approach to fusion cooking. Natasha smiled and waved like she'd been on television hundreds of times before and launched into a speech about her inspiration for the cookbook. What made it worse was that she clearly knew the material. She talked about specific recipes and techniques with enough detail to sound credible, and she even shared some of the personal stories I'd included in the book as if they were her own experiences. When she demonstrated making my grandmother's cornbread with a Mediterranean herb crust, she told the audience about how the recipe had been passed down through generations in her family. The host was charmed by Natasha's personality and kept asking follow-up questions about her cooking philosophy and future projects. Natasha handled every question smoothly, talking about the importance of combining comfort and sophistication in home cooking. She even mentioned that she was already working on a second cookbook, which was news to me since I hadn't started planning one yet. During the commercial break, I heard one of the crew members say they were already getting positive feedback about the segment and that the show's website was seeing increased traffic. The host seemed genuinely excited about the cookbook and was talking about having Natasha back for a longer segment next month. I realized that my sister's theft wasn't just ruining this one opportunity, it was potentially destroying my entire career. When the segment ended, Natasha came back to the green room beaming with excitement. She acted like everything was perfectly normal and started talking about how well the interview had gone. She said the host had invited her back and that this could be the beginning of a whole new career for her. When I pointed out that it was supposed to be my career, she just shrugged and said, "We can figure out the details later." The ride home was tense and silent. I kept thinking about all the work I'd put into that cookbook and how Natasha had just stolen credit for it in front of millions of people. Every recipe, every story, every technique demonstration, she'd just claimed as her own work. I felt violated in a way I'd never experienced before, like someone had stolen my identity and was parading around in it. When we got back to my apartment, Natasha finally tried to explain herself. She said she'd been planning to tell me about her plan, but that the opportunity had come up suddenly, and she had to act fast. She claimed that she'd been in touch with the show's producers for weeks trying to get me booked, but that they weren't interested until she positioned herself as the author. According to Natasha, the producers had been lukewarm about interviewing an unknown chef, but when she presented herself as the cookbook author with a marketing background, they became much more enthusiastic. She said she'd planned to give me credit during the interview, but that there hadn't been a natural opportunity to bring it up. Everything she said sounded like carefully constructed lies designed to justify the unjustifiable. After Natasha left my apartment that day, I spent hours trying to figure out what to do next. The segment had already aired, and thousands of people now believe my sister was the author of my cookbook. I checked social media and saw that the show's official accounts had posted clips of the interview crediting Natasha as the cookbook author. Food blogs were already picking up the story and sharing details about her upcoming second cookbook. I called my publisher immediately, but it was a Friday afternoon, and I only reached the assistant editor. When I explained what had happened, she seemed confused and said she'd never heard of anyone named Natasha being associated with the cookbook. She promised to look into it first thing Monday morning, but that felt like an eternity away. Every hour that passed meant more people seeing the false information and accepting it as truth. My agent was out of town at a conference, but I left her several voicemails explaining the situation. I also sent emails with screenshots of the show's website and social media posts showing Natasha being credited as the author. I felt helpless knowing that my sister's lie was spreading across the internet while I had no way to stop it or correct the record. That weekend was torture. I kept checking social media and seeing more posts about Natasha's cookbook interview. Food influencers were sharing the segment and praising her presentation skills. Some were even saying they were excited to try recipes from her upcoming second book. It felt surreal watching my sister build a fake career on the foundation of my work. Monday morning, my publisher called me back and confirmed that there had been no communication from anyone named Natasha about the television appearance. The marketing department had been just as surprised as I was to see someone else claiming credit for the book. They were already working on damage control, reaching out to the show's producers to clarify the situation and demanding corrections on all their platforms. But the real shock came when my agent called me back that afternoon. She'd done some investigating over the weekend and discovered that Natasha had been actively impersonating me for months. Using a fake email address and business cards, she'd been reaching out to media outlets and claiming to be the cookbook author. She'd even created a professional website with my book's information but her name and photo as the author. According to my agent, Natasha had been incredibly systematic about her deception. She'd researched media contacts and pitched herself for interviews using detailed knowledge about the cookbook that she'd gained from our conversations. She'd even created fake social media accounts with thousands of followers to make herself appear more credible to producers and journalists. The television show's producers were embarrassed when they realized they'd been deceived and immediately pulled all content related to the interview from their website and social media accounts. They also canceled the follow-up segment that had been scheduled for the next month. But the damage was already done. Thousands of people had seen Natasha claiming credit for my work, and those impressions couldn't be easily undone. My publisher decided to take legal action against Natasha for fraud and impersonation. They'd invested significant money in the cookbook, and her actions had damaged both the book's reputation and their company's credibility. The legal team sent her a cease and desist letter demanding that she stop claiming credit for the cookbook and publicly retract all false statements. When I confronted Natasha about the extent of her deception, she initially tried to deny it, but faced with evidence from my agent and publisher, she finally admitted what she'd been doing. She said she'd started small, just reaching out to 1 or 2 local outlets, but that things had snowballed when she realized how easy it was to get media attention by claiming credit for the cookbook. What shocked me most was her complete lack of remorse. She seemed genuinely confused about why I was so upset and kept insisting that her marketing expertise had generated more publicity for the book than I ever could have achieved on my own. She said we should be working together to capitalize on the momentum she'd created rather than fighting about who deserved credit. Natasha also revealed that she'd been planning this deception for months, ever since she realized how much media interest the cookbook was generating. She'd systematically gathered information during our conversations and used her marketing skills to position herself as a credible cookbook author. She'd even taken a crash course in cooking techniques so she could handle interviews more convincingly. The legal pressure finally got to her when my publisher's lawyers threatened to sue her for damages. She agreed to send correction letters to every media outlet she'd contacted, admitting that she'd falsely claimed credit for the cookbook. She also had to post public retractions on all her social media accounts and take down the fake website she created. But even as she was making these corrections, Natasha continued to minimize what she'd done. She kept saying it had just been a marketing strategy that got out of hand, and that she'd always planned to give me proper credit eventually. She seemed genuinely unable to understand that what she'd done was theft not just of credit, but of my professional identity and years of hard work. The aftermath was professionally devastating for her. Her employer found out about the fraud when journalists started asking questions about her cookbook claims, and she was fired for misrepresenting herself and potentially damaging the company's reputation. Several of her other clients also dropped her when they learned about her deceptive practices. My relationship with Natasha was completely destroyed. I couldn't trust anything she said anymore, and every interaction felt like she might be planning some new scheme to take advantage of me. When she tried to apologize and suggest we could rebuild our relationship, I told her I needed space to process everything that had happened. The worst part was realizing how long she'd been planning this betrayal. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a misunderstanding that got out of hand. She'd systematically gathered information about my work and used it to build a false identity as a cookbook author. She'd stolen not just credit for my recipes, but the entire story of my culinary journey. 2 weeks after the legal mess started, I was at home trying to focus on developing new recipes when I got a call from a producer at the Food Network. They'd heard about my cookbook through industry contacts and wanted to discuss a potential television project. My heart jumped because this was exactly the kind of opportunity every chef dreams about, but then I realized they might have heard about the Natasha situation. When I explained who I was, the producer seemed confused. She said they'd been in contact with someone about comfort crossing, but that person had introduced herself as Natasha, the cookbook author. My stomach dropped as I realized my sister was still actively impersonating me despite the legal warnings and all the corrections she'd been forced to make. The producer explained that they'd been impressed by Natasha's presentation during a phone interview the previous week and were considering offering her a development deal for a cooking show. They'd scheduled a follow-up meeting for that Friday where she was supposed to demonstrate some recipes and discuss her culinary background. I couldn't believe Natasha was still trying to build a career on my stolen work. I immediately called my lawyer, who confirmed that Natasha's continued impersonation violated the cease and desist agreement and could result in serious legal consequences. But I realized that legal action would take time, and by then she might have signed a deal with Food Network based on fraudulent claims. I needed to act quickly to prevent her from stealing another major opportunity. That's when I decided to make one phone call that would end this once and for all. I called the Food Network producer back and asked if I could meet with her before Natasha's scheduled appointment. I explained that there had been a case of identity theft and that I could provide documentation proving I was the actual author of Comfort Crossing. The producer was shocked but agreed to meet with me Thursday afternoon. I spent Wednesday night preparing for the meeting, gathering every piece of evidence I could find to prove my identity as the cookbook author. I brought my original contract with the publisher, signed photographs from the cookbook development process, and even some of my grandmother's handwritten recipe cards that had inspired several dishes in the book. I also prepared to demonstrate the 3 recipes that Natasha had planned to make during her meeting. The Thursday meeting went better than I could have hoped. The Food Network producer was appalled when she realized how extensively she'd been deceived and immediately understood why I'd contacted her. She was particularly impressed when I demonstrated my grandmother's cornbread recipe and shared the real family story behind it, something Natasha had fabricated during her television interview. The producer explained that they'd been suspicious about some inconsistencies in Natasha's story during their phone interview. She'd been vague about certain technical aspects of cooking and had seemed unfamiliar with some basic culinary terminology. They'd attributed it to nervousness, but now it made perfect sense. She'd been trying to discuss topics she didn't actually understand. After reviewing my documentation and watching me cook, the producer was convinced that I was the legitimate cookbook author. She immediately canceled Natasha's Friday meeting and began discussing potential opportunities for me instead. She said the Food Network was always looking for authentic voices in the culinary world, and that my story of overcoming family betrayal to protect my work was compelling. Friday morning arrived, and I knew Natasha would be showing up at Food Network expecting to film a demo that could launch her stolen career. I wasn't there to witness it, but my lawyer later told me what happened. Security met Natasha at the reception desk and informed her that her meeting had been canceled due to fraudulent misrepresentation. She was also served with additional legal papers for violating the cease and desist agreement. According to the security report, Natasha initially tried to argue that there had been a misunderstanding, but when they showed her evidence of my meeting with the producer the previous day, she completely broke down. She spent 20 minutes crying in the lobby before finally leaving the building. One of the security guards said she kept repeating, "She ruined everything," which I found ironic since she was the one who'd tried to ruin my career. The Food Network incident was the final straw for everyone who'd been affected by Natasha's deception. My publisher decided to pursue maximum legal penalties, including financial damages, for the harm done to the cookbook's reputation. Several media outlets that had been fooled by her initial claims also began investigating how they'd been deceived. Within a week, the story of Natasha's impersonation became a cautionary tale in food media circles. Industry publications wrote articles about the importance of verifying author credentials, and several cooking websites shared the story as an example of how social media can be used to create false identities. Natasha went from being an unknown marketing professional to being infamous in the culinary world. The personal cost to our family was enormous. My parents were devastated when they learned the full extent of what Natasha had done and struggled to understand how their daughter could betray her sister so systematically. They'd been proud when they saw her television interview, but now felt humiliated knowing it had all been based on lies. Natasha tried reaching out to me several times after the Food Network incident, but I'd blocked her on all platforms and instructed my lawyer to handle any communication. She sent letters through my parents claiming she was seeking help for her behavior and wanted to make amends, but I wasn't interested in hearing her explanations anymore. The silver lining came 6 months later when Food Network offered me my own cooking show based on the cookbook and my personal story of perseverance. The show, Comfort Crossing with Chef Sarah, premiered to positive reviews and helped establish me as a legitimate voice in food television. The irony wasn't lost on me that Natasha's theft had ultimately led to even better opportunities than I might have had otherwise. But the betrayal changed me permanently. I became much more protective of my work and more careful about who I trusted with information about my projects. I also learned to document everything and keep detailed records of my creative process. What Natasha did taught me that even family members could become competitors willing to steal your life's work for their own advancement. Looking back, I'm grateful that I had the courage to make that one phone call to Food Network. If I'd hesitated or tried to handle things diplomatically, Natasha might have succeeded in stealing another major opportunity. Sometimes protecting yourself requires decisive action, even when it means exposing someone you love as a fraud. Today I have the career I always dreamed of, and my cookbook continues to sell well despite the initial confusion caused by Natasha's deception. She eventually moved to another state, and, as far as I know, has stayed out of the food industry entirely. My parents and I slowly rebuilt our relationship, but Natasha remains persona non grata at family gatherings. The experience taught me that success can make you a target even within your own family, and that some betrayals are so fundamental they can't be forgiven or forgotten. But it also showed me that truth has a way of prevailing if you're willing to fight for it, and that sometimes the people who try to steal your dreams end up helping you achieve even bigger ones.